In this last video, I'm going to walk through the schematic on a couple of images that are more complicated than a smiley face. So they will more closely approximate at least the Lee Griggs images that he has done. And I think it's going to be a little more efficient just to walk through the graphs than try to build these things from scratch. One of the images I did is this one. So this is actually the Amazon rainforest from a satellite view. And you can see sort of the river coming up through here. And these are the trees, obviously. And you've got this ripple texture on the river. So if I were to render out an animated sequence, there would actually be a rippling motion going down these particles. You can see in close-up that this sort of jumble of small, square, densely packed particles with these little cants in rotation is sort of giving it a kind of cool watery look. It's almost like water with little glass cubes making water. I thought it was kind of cool. There's a lot of subsurface scattering on here. One of the interesting things is, in the previous smiley face video, we had done, or I had showed shading based on, distance from a locator, which sort of gave an altitude-based shading. And on closer examination, I don't know what was wrong with my powers of observation that day, but, he's really not doing like a altitude-type shading where the shading changes based on the height. It's really just based on size, right? So these bigger, taller ones are getting the lighter values, not just white. There's some nice variation in there, and the smaller cubes are getting really dark shading, and there's all these blues in between. So that's what I'm doing on this one right here, and you can kind of see how that's going to work. And I'll show you. I'm actually using Nodal shading this time around, and I'll walk through that as well. The other image I did was this volcano. Whoops, it's got some smoke. So the volume smoke is from the same particle generator used for the cubes. And again, I'm just trying to get... Oh, and this one is a little bit different. I'm using two prototypes for the replicator. One is a sphere to create the lava, and the other one is just the cube for the mountain. I just thought I'd try something different. And in this close-up, you can see like the little spheres for the lava. It looks kind of cool. And then all these cubes, and they're really dense. Lots of replicas on these images. And again, there's this sort of smoky layer, which was using this just a volume item. I'll show you how I did that. Using the same particle source. Also output a luminous layer on here, or a luminous render output, and put a little glow on there to make the lava a little bit cooler looking. I don't know if that's cheating or not. Maybe it's not cheating. Nothing's cheating. It's just art. Okay, so let's get to this guy. So this time around, instead of using a pMod generator, which generates an array, I'm using a surface particle generator. And if you haven't used those before, they're over here under particles and point clouds and surface particle generator right there. Here's the guy. And these are actually really powerful. Unfortunately, they're also really slow to calculate. So you got to be kind of careful using them and kind of get your distributions down with a low particle count and then gradually increase it for the final render. So right now, you've got a couple of good channels here to mess with. You've got average spacing, minimum spacing, and a particle ceiling. And what happens is, let's say if I knock this spacing down, let's say divide everything by 5, go here, and you can see it's kind of a slow. But you'll see what it does is when these average and minimum spacings are low, it starts to populate this surface input, this plane here. And when it runs out of particles, the particle ceiling, then it just stops. So you have to have enough particles in the particle ceiling to populate the entire surface. And, like I said, it can get really slow. I actually have my display density down to 0 because, let me just turn off my replicator here. If I turn my display density on, I'll say it's 50%, you'll see the particles being displayed there. But even displaying them really bogs down Modo quite a bit, so I tend to keep that at 0. And the problem is I can't just turn it off because then it turns off it just no longer functions towards the replicator. So you have to keep this eyeball on, which I think is a bug. I think you should be the visibility this should be passing information along whether it's visible or not. Anyway, so let me turn this to I keep that there. Let me bump this back up. So I think I had 50 and 10, but in the final image, this image here, I think I had, the average spacing down to 5 millimeters and the minimum spacing at 1 millimeter, so 10 times as dense as this. And instead of 100,000 particles, I think I had 3 million particles for this image. And that takes a lot of RAM, so you really do need a lot of RAM to get these images to look like this. Okay, so let's move on here. I'm going to turn the display density back to 0. And what's cool about a surface particle generator is you've got some, besides just these channels here, you have some other options for distribution. You can use density VMaps or gradients for, VMaps or gradients for density. It also has built-in VMaps and gradients for size. You can also do a vector map, which is really cool. That's how you do hair in Modo, right? So you can assign a vector map to this. I'm not going to show you how to do it right now, but then you can also use the hair sculpting tools to paint the vector, to scale them. It does size, it does orientation, it does all that stuff with the vector map in one map, and you can sort of when you tie that to a replicator, your cubes their orientation, you can swirl them around just like hair, and they'll follow around the vector map. So vector map is kind of cool if you want to play with that. But those are some built-in ways to adjust distribution. You can also adjust distribution in the shader tree, which is cool. So this guy right here has an item mask on it. So I go over to the shader tree here. The surface particle generator has an item mask. I'm masking that item. And what that's going to let me do is use the shader tree to throw some textures in here. And I can adjust the particle density or the dissolve or the particle size in the shader tree. And it'd be great to even have some more options in there. But you can use images and textures and gradients to adjust these things and set some initial values. So in fact, let me turn my replicator back on. And then what I'm going to do to sort of break this down is I'm going to bypass all these pMods here, right? So these are all, not that guy, but these are all pMods that take these initial settings that are defined in the channels here and also in the shader tree with this item mask. And then they're sort of split up and modified with pMods, then combined back together and fed into a replicator. And this is all the nodal shading up there, by the way, which I'll get to. So I'm actually going to bypass everything by unplugging this end of chain guy from the replicator and just snaking a little line all the way to the end here. So that's what it looks like without any of the pMods in there and with this mask turned off. So if I split that and create a preview over here, this is the camera view. This is the same camera view we have here. Notice they're all the same size and the same density essentially, because it's just being defined, the size and density are just being defined right here, okay? So when I create a surface particle generator, an item mask for the surface particle generator, and of course you just right click on these to create an item mask, right? Wherever that is, down here at the bottom, create item mask. Then I can start using images to really adjust these. So I'm going to start at the bottom. And we've got this image that I'm using. In fact, let me turn off the replicator and turn on the image in the shader tree just so you can see what I'm dealing with here. Plane. Let's turn this guy on. So there's the image I'm using, right? See it over here? And you can look at this and look at this. And you get it, right? There's the river coming along here. And that's defining density and some initial size and density values of these particles that are later being populated with these cubes. So over here, if I look down here in the effects portion of my shader tree, if I turn this guy on, actually let me not do that yet. Sorry. Let me turn off that guy, turn my replicator back on. So again, you have this sort of uniform distribution. Now if I turn on just my particle density, you'll notice right away, it's easier to see over here, that you can see the rivers, or the river, and all the tributaries, sort of right off the bat. It's just more dense in those white areas of that map than it is for the trees around here. So that's my initial particle density, but all the size is still the same. So I've got another image, same image, and I'm just applying that to particle size. But this time I've inverted it. So I've got little tiny particles where the river is, and much bigger particles where the trees are. Now this doesn't look anything like this because there's some additional work being done in the pMod section after we set these initial values here. And there's one more really important part of the shader tree at the top. And what this gradient is going to do at the top. So now remember, the shader tree goes bottom up, right? So we're setting the particle density, then I'm setting the particle size. And I'm looking at the particle size here, and because I've inverted that image, I have an image that looks like this, where the water is black. And I'm getting a particle size of near 0 for all these guys. So they're way too small. You can barely even see them, right, compared to the trees. So I need to bring up the size of the water particles without affecting the size of the trees. And I can do that with a gradient that's going to remap those size values. And like I said, we're reading from the bottom up, so the gradient is picking up the input parameter as particle size. So it's picking that up. It's already been defined right here, right? Actually, it was initially defined here, and it was defined again here with this image. And we're going to take this particle size definition, and we're going to remap it with a gradient. And it's similar. If you could take a look at this, pop that open, you'll see this is the remapping of the particle size. And so when I turn this on, now it may look kind of subtle on this little screen, but you'll see the particles in the water are much bigger. Well, the trees are left alone essentially. So I turn this back off. Can't hardly see anything here in the water. The particles are tiny. Turn it back on. We have much bigger particles, and these are defined. You could look at them right here. See, they're very small in the water. If I look at the close-up, they're much smaller than most of the trees. Some of the trees are pretty small, but they're essentially a fairly uniform size. So if I look at my map here, what I've done is I've brought everything from 0 up to about 17%. In fact, the particle size on the bottom, and everything from 0 to 40%, I sort of leveled out and through this smaller range from about 17 to 25% here. And that's very similar to going into like Photoshop and doing this, right? I've got my black values here, and I'm just bringing up black values, right? I'm not affecting the whites really at all. I mean, I'm not really affecting the midtones a little bit. I'm crunching it, but I'm mostly just bringing up my darks. And that's what's going on here by taking this, which initially was at 0, and gave me particles that were way too small over here. Let's see if this updates with these speeds. They all just went away, right? And so I'm bringing those back up. And now I have a fairly even size distribution on these little tiny particles, the water particles here. They're all kind of the same size now. I bumped it up a couple of times. So I did the same thing. I've got some medium-sized, I've got some medium-sized ones here. Zoom in. This. So I've got some medium-sized ones, and I bump it up again for some tall trees. So if you look at my image, again, you've got some really tall trees in here, in the sort of undergrowth, understory there, the blue ones, and then, of course, the water particles at the very bottom. And so now that I've sort of defined my initial particle sizes over here in the shader tree, they've been defined in this item right here now, using, a combination of these parameters here, the spacing, and a density image and size images. And then I just go on and split them up using these sieves, sort of like I did previously. So this sieve is taking 0 to 4 in this range, right? If size is from 0 to 0.3999, it keeps them. And you'll notice, of course, that size that is mapping to this value here. Grab a value. I have to grab it down here. So that's 0.4. So again, if I look at my node, this node here, 0 to 0.4, that's these guys, right? I'm grabbing, undo. I'm grabbing this section right here essentially, and then I'm calling that sieve lowlands water 0 to 0.4. Always name your nodes so you can tell what they're doing. Sieving out to medium range and sieving out a high range. So let's take a look at these now. So I'm going to disconnect my medium and highs and just take a look at the water here. These guys right here, and I'm unplugging my surface particle generator, also known as an SPG from the replicator, and I'm gonna plug back in this chain at the top. So I'm only looking at the water now. I've isolated the water particles, these sort of uniformly sized water particles with the sieve pMod. And then I'm just going to go down the chain here and make some alterations. So initially I just put on a random rotation node. And so I'm just grabbing all these particles, all these little ones here, and doing a little bit of random rotation, 10% in every axis. And if you look at the image, you'll see, especially in this close-up one, you'll see that there's a little bit of rotation on all these guys. That top plane is catching the light here, but not here, because they're all facing sort of different angles, and it gives a sort of watery look, which I really thought was cool. And so then, again, we do a little bit of random rotation on all of them, and then I send it off to another random modifier. And this one's interesting because it has a falloff on it. Okay, so you see the falloff there covering the entire plane. And this falloff, as you might have guessed, has been item masked, and it has a texture in it, and this is the waves texture. And a lot of times what I'll do when I have a texture down here in the effects portion that doesn't show up in a preview, I'll just instance it. I'll right click and instance the texture right there, and drag it up here into the shading evaluation part of the shader tree and turn it on so I can kind of see what it's looking like. And so this is the waves texture right here. You can kind of see the ripples. And this is providing information to the fall off, right? This fall off, it's the effect is set to fall off value. So this linear fall off here is the value of this fall off is being defined by the waves texture. And that's feeding into the fall off slot of this pMod here, this random particle modifier. And it's doing a little bit of work with it. It is upping the position, and it's doing a little more rotation, and it's doing a little bit of scale on there, and the range is -100 to 100. And so on the light parts, it's getting the maximum position, it's going up the highest, and on the dark parts, it's going down the most. It's getting the least amount of these values. Same with rotation and scale. So what that's doing for me, I hope I'm explaining that well enough, is I'm getting this sort of ripple texture here, because where the ripples are white, these particles are getting moved up the most, and they're expanding 10%, and they're getting even a little more rotation, so they're more light glinting on them. So that's what this node right here is doing, and I'm able to control that with this waves texture. And of course, the waves are animated, so if the waves are all rolling this way, if I were to render an animation, you get this cool rolling effect of, as the wave texture moves this way, these particles are going to move up. They're going to expand a little bit. They're going to rotate a little more, and you're going to get this cool rolling effect in an animation, which I did not render because it would take forever. So yeah, maybe I'll do that sometime. Anyway, so that's where we're going there, and then that's it. Then they're fed into this random particle ID combiner. Basically, it's just a random, pMod, and the only thing I'm randomizing is particle ID. So when I combine all these chains back together, I'm just randomizing their particle ID because I can use that in shading. So let me unhook the water and plug the trees back in. Now we're just looking at the trees, right? All right, so let's go back here. So I sieved out a medium range here and a high range based on the sizes that we had defined with the textures here in SPG. And just doing some random Y scale on both of these. So on the medium range, bumping it up Y 120%, whereas the really tall trees, I'm bumping it up 350%. And, I just threw a fall off on both of these. The tree random scale linear fall off, which is right here, is using an image that I blurred a little bit. And again, I'm just, altering the values a little bit in here. So I'm just giving a little more randomization to it. I'm on the lightest parts, they're getting the most scale difference, and on the darker parts of this image, they're getting the least. So we've got a little more randomization going on for the scale, but this is how we're getting the really tall, sort of tree-like particles in there. We're bumping up their Y scale by 350%, modulated just a little bit by this blurry texture. Same thing with these medium guys, just not as much. And then moving along, I've got tree scale up, linear fall off, and again, I'm just doing a little uniform scaling on everything, right? right? So I've got a minimum and maximum range here from -100 to 5%. And you see I have this giant scale, 150% on X and 150% on Z, with 0 on Y. And what I'm doing is I'm just taking the negative part of that range. So -150, -150. And if I, let me just sort of bypass this so you'll see what happens. I've got these really tall, thin guys, right? Because that's what I'm doing here. I'm doing a negative scale because of my range, which is all in the negative here. I'm only doing a little tiny 5% of these guys in positive, but almost all of these are going to the negative side of the scale. If I were to pull this guy out, if I were just to move directly to this node, pull this guy out, you'll notice that I don't have the really, really thin guys. But if I go over here and then go in, I've used this node to get really thin trees, right? By scale. I liked the height that I had done here. I was happy with the height, but I wanted these guys skinnier. So I had another node to scale, make them skinny, because it's all in the negative range. And again, I'm just sort of modulating this a little bit with the fall off, the texture value. So there's just a little bit of modulation going on there. And then this guy right here, it's a basic node right there. And again, let me actually back up. Any of these nodes, just about any of these nodes, can take multiple particle sources and it'll combine them together. So, even though I split these trees between the, medium scale and the really large ones, and then, took the large ones and made them really tall and the medium scale ones and made them kind of tall, I'm combining them here to adjust the, make them all skinny, right? So I've combined them, those two chains here. And then moving along, I just did a little more of a shrink in the scale X and Z. I just thought they weren't quite skinny enough, so I made them a little skinnier. And moved on to remove particles. And here I just thought they were too dense, right? So I feel like the trees, I was just getting too much density in the trees. I really wanted super dense water, but I needed to thin out the herd, so to speak, in the trees. So I have a remove particles, which is really, it's just a sieve, okay? It's just a sieve right here. And I'm just sieving on particle ID. So if particle ID is less than 0.75, I keep the particles. And everything greater than every particle ID greater than 0.75 is I'm getting rid of them. So I'm getting rid of about a quarter of the particles here. And the particle ID, because we're starting with the surface particle generator, they're pretty random to begin with. They're not ordered like if you had used an array. So I've thinned out a few of the particles, and then I combined them all here. And when you combine different particle sources, the particle IDs do get sort of crunched, I think, in a sort of a weird way, where often one of these streams will get just a very small range of new particle IDs. So they'll get they have to have new particle IDs assigned, right? Because you're combining them, so you don't have clashing particle IDs. And what I've noticed is a lot of times when you combine multiple particle streams, like this stream may get particle IDs from a range of like 0.95 to 1, where this one gets 0 to 0.95. So this one gets 95% of the particle IDs, where this one gets this very small range. So I always put this random pMod at the end here, and all I'm doing is randomizing the particle IDs, because when I go into shading, I often use random particle IDs to vary up the shading. And so this is combining them all together and feeding to the replicator, and that's what we have. So, and this is it, right? It's just much, much denser, right? So this is this image minus the density. So, it's easy to work at a low density, and then when you kind of have what you want, you go back to your surface particle generator, and you lower the spacing, average spacing, and minimum spacing, and crank up the particle ceiling, and do your final render. And that's how the trees are set up. So that's the particle portion of the schematic. Let's take a look at the nodal shading here, which is a little bit different than what we did last time in the smiley face version of this. So I'm over here in the render tab, and I want to talk about nodal shading just a little bit, so we can kind of see how this is done in this scene. This particular camera view is this close-up view right here, which I think on the larger scene, I think it's this little area right here. This little inlet right there is where we're zoomed in. And looking at the nodal shading, let me just sort of shift up here to the nodal shading part of the schematic. You may actually want to put these in a different workspace. That sometimes is a good idea, but I didn't, so shame on me. Everything's feeding this way, right? I've got these 4 or 5 guys over here, and these are constant layers. So this is how I like to work with nodal shading in Modo. It's actually an advantage, I think, over other nodal shaders where typically what you would do if you're in Maya or something is you would have your material with all these channels here, and this would be in your schematic, and each one of these nodes here would be feeding into one of these channels on the material item. But we have this sort of additional built-in layering system right in Modo, and it does things. Some things are better than the schematic. You can turn things on and off very quickly. You can adjust opacities and blend modes and rearrange the orders and layer them together and mask them and change the effect to something else, reflection or something instead of diffuse amount, very quickly. In fact, it's faster than dealing with the schematic. So it's really the best of both worlds, and that's how I like to work. It is different than some other programs. I know some people they just don't seem to get it. It just doesn't seem to permeate their brain that they have to bring in the material node and drag everything in there because that's the way you do it in Maya, and this other thing is whatever, incomprehensible, I suppose. But yeah, take advantage of the layers in Modo and just feed your channels into constant nodes, and then you can set the effect over here and the opacity and everything else and the layering, whatever you want to do. Okay, got that out of my system. So I'm just going to go through this really quickly. At the very left-hand side is I have a shader input, and it's just right here under shader inputs, and this one is a particle sample. So I'm sampling particle channels from the scene. Now, this isn't necessarily any different than, let's say, I just paused. If I add a gradient to the scene, I've got all kinds of inputs on the gradient. I have particle inputs, right? I have age and ID and velocity and texture particle ID. I can get these from a gradient. So it's not like you have to use the schematic. I have a few more things like vectors and velocities I'm getting over here from this luminosity. Some additional channels I'm getting from this shader input node. But you don't have to use this for the schematic. Really, the only thing I'm grabbing is particle ID and particle size. And so right off the bat, I'm using particle ID to inputting it into a gradient. So if you input the particle ID into the in value in a gradient, if I go over here to the gradient editor, this axis along the bottom, that's the inval, right? So the particle ID goes from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100. So all the particles are normalized between 0 and 1, and I just have this sort of random gradient in here from about 55 to 75 in value, kind of going up and down. In fact, you can, if you look at the gradient, let me select over here in the schematic, and you see the black and white in this little mini graph over here, and that's just setting some different diffuse values on all of these replicas, right? So it's going over to this constant diffuse value. Constant, really it's just a constant node, and over here is where I'm setting the effect to diffuse value. I could change this to a diffuse color if I want, or some other value like transparency or something like that. But that's the ease of using these constant nodes in the schematic, and then just changing the effect over here in the shader tree. But that's feeding into value. And remember, when you're going out, the texture value, texture color, these are the computed value and color of this node. So you're outputting this, not this top one here. Okay, that's where we're inputting stuff. But the down one here, this value, see how it's sort of colored in with this orange. That has values there. That's this graph right here. And then we're outputting it from the bottom right there. Okay, so that's going to diffuse amount. I've named this, right? And same thing in the bottom, and just particle ID, and I'm changing as the input value, and then I'm going over here. I'm mixing them up a little bit. I'm over cranking it at maybe 130 at the top and 80 at the bottom. So I have a little bit higher SSS amounts, subsurface scattering amounts, than diffuse amounts. And again, just throwing those values into the constant and setting the constant's effect to subsurface amount. So what I'm doing is I'm using a texture to sort of pump up the reflection Fresnel value at certain parts of the image. So over here, if I look at it, I've got just a noise node, and you can grab this over here. I go to shader, nodes, and texture, and there's noise. And that'll add it to the schematic, and it'll put it over here in my nodes folder in my shader tree. One thing you want to make certain you do is on the texture locator is set the set it to world coordinates. And that will create a sort of these, this 3D texture throughout the entire scene that the replicas will intersect with. Wherever they're at in the scene, they'll pick up that texture value. If you don't have it set to world coordinates, it's just going to texture our single cube replica at the center of the screen, the center of the world there, and then replicate those exact same values throughout the scene. So you want to set that to world coordinates. And if I go over here, I always, I like to instance that and put it into my shader tree so I can kind of get an idea of where it is. So here's that constant reflection for now. I have it set to diffuse amount. So if I'm just going to split this guy real quick so I can keep this paused and unpause this over here. So if I turn on this layer here in the plane where I have it set to diffuse amount, again, I just instanced the texture down here, this guy right here, drag it up to my plane, change the effect to diffuse amount because I just want to kind of visualize where it's going to be. So I'm going to get more hotter reflection for now on the replicas that are in this area and not so much here. I'm just trying to add some variation to it to get kind of a cool look. And that's all I'm doing with that. So I'm sending this noise texture to a color correct node, and you can find that under Add, Color Correct, right? And all I'm doing there is I'm just remapping these noise values. So now if I go over to Photoshop, it's basically, here's a little bit of a noise sort of image. And if I bring up a curve, I can remap those values by, crunching these guys in the black down there and crunching some white there and maybe sort of giving a little bit of an S curve to create more of a blobby, contrasty noise. And if you look at Modo, previously you only had these really pretty horrible bias and gain controls to try and get something like that. And now we have this cool color correct node, which allows you to go in and you can see it here in the gradient editor as well, sort of crunch these values in on the side, right? So I'm crunched from this key from 0 all the way into 0.5 and this one from 1 all the way down to 0.95. So it's a little more contrasty. One thing to be aware of, and this is a bug that I've filed, the color correct nodes are super slow to calculate, and hopefully that's going to be fixed. I think I'm running an SP2, 801 SP2, so don't believe it's been fixed yet, but it's definitely bugged, and it's unfortunate that it's so slow. You can see the preview trying to fill it in still. But that's just what we're dealing with right now. Okay, so again, let's move along. I'm going to turn this off. I don't have to visualize that anymore, but that's how we're getting some additional reflection for now values on to our replicas. These last two I'm doing constant. This one is going to SSS color, and this one is going to diffuse color. And there's quite a bit going on in here. Initially, we're taking the particle size, right? So the shader input, I think I can pause that now. The shader input is grabbing the particle size from the screen, and then it's sending this into a gradient as an input parameter. One of the things to keep in mind is the particle size is set right here with the surface particle generator. And if you remember, what we did is we item masked that. It's down here. And then we have a couple of layers here in the shader tree, an image and a gradient to sort of remap the image to adjust the particle size. That's how we got the sort of constant size on the water and these larger sizes on the trees. And then what we've done here is we've continued to go, along we added a bunch of pMods and adjusted the sizes a lot more. I got this skinny look and did some randomization. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, the shader input only recognizes the initial particle size set by the surface particle generator. It's not recognizing any of these particle size values that we've adjusted later on. So it's sampling this initial value set here. That's just something to keep in mind in case you're, if we had used a pMod generator and created an array of particles and then modified the particle size all along here, this node only would have noticed the initial size, which would have been 1 with the array modifier. And so it's just something to keep in mind. I don't know if that's a bug or a limitation, but we're only analyzing the size from the initial settings we put here on the surface particle generator. All right, to explain what's going on with the SSS color and diffuse color, I'm going to incorporate some Photoshop so I can kind of draw along what's happening. So you've got the particle size, right? And that's being evaluated, being sampled from the scene and being fed into this gradient right here. And so this is our main gradient. If I look at the gradient editor and the color, size going from 0 to the smallest to the largest. We've got blue to white, and obviously that's kind of what we're dealing with here. And on this screen, blue to white at the biggest. But there's quite a bit going on in between to get all this sort of subtle variation you see in these, which looks kind of so cool. And that is happening with a number of blending nodes and color correct nodes and a few other masking nodes. So we're spitting off this main gradient, right? This main sort of blue and to dark blue to white gradient. And initially, let's take a look at the constant diffuse color and what we're doing with that. So we're sending one stream of it to a color blend node, okay? And a color blend node can be found up here under color and color blend. And what that allows you to do is take two inputs, color 1, color 2, and blend it with a value and also with a mask. So I'm actually doing 100% blend, so we get 100% of each color depending on where they fall in the mask. And for the mask, I'm using a gradient V. And this is similar to what we did on the smiley face tutorial, where we're sampling from the bottom to the top. And actually, let me maybe show this in Photoshop a little bit. So, here's the gradient V acting as a mask to this color, right? So we've got a certain amount of blue color being applied to each one of these guys, right? But I want to just sort of adjust it going along the length here. And so I have a UV map, right? So pretend this is a little UV map, right, of these cubes. And they're all laid out. So the bottom of the cube, those points are on V0. And these points at the top of the cube are on V1, right? So here's V, 0 to 1. And what this gradient right here does is it's reading, it's sampling everything along the length, the V values along the length there. And I've got a value in that gradient. So if I look at this gradient here, along this bottom axis from 0 to 1 are these V values, right, along the length here. The V values of 0 at the bottom, V values of 1 at the top. And I've got a value curve map to that. So I've got 100% at the top of these guys and black basically 0% at the bottom. And I'm using that as a mask. So there's a mask going in between this color blend mode is using this color gradient right here, this color gradient right here, and a slightly hue and saturation altered version using a color correct node. Hue 15%, saturation 10%, so we're altering the hue and saturation of that blue gradient and blending them together along the length. So in Photoshop, if I were to look at just this mask here, if I had like one of these little cubes, I would have white at the top going to black at the bottom. And this mask is going in, I've got this, acting as a mask between this blue and green gradient right here, right? So this gradient is we've got this cool gradient right here. This node has got these colors from blue to this side and sort of whitish on this side, right? The biggest ones. And then this color correct node right here, those have been just hue shifted a little bit. So like in Photoshop, if you shift the hue, you're shifting the hue like that, and it's shifting the saturation a little bit as well. And so this gradient's been hue and saturation shifted, and we're blending it all together here with this mask. And so we get sort of the normal gradient at the top, this blue right here. Let's say we get these regular blues. Whoops, not what I wanted to do. We get these regular blues at the top, and because we're using this mask, we get some slightly hue and saturation shifted blues, at the bottom of these guys, and that's how it works. And then we're taking that, because we're using nodal shading, we can just do this as many times as we want. So we're taking that output from this color blend and sending it to another color blend, where we're taking a gradient incidence angle as a mask. So here we have a gradient on the incidence angle. So, the incidence angle of this is sort of a facing, whoops, let me get my white. So this plane right here is sort of facing us. Well, this plane right here, this guy, is sort of at a glancing angle, right? And so I'm using that as a mask. So this glancing angle gets, sort of these values, where the facing value gets these values. And I'm using that as a mask on this color blend node to, again, blend between this output of the first one we had that I just explained just with another one where I've taken my original colors and I've hue and saturation shifted them the opposite direction. So on the gradient, and on the incidence angle here, on these sort of facing angles, you'll get, let me sort of keep my motif going here. So here's this guy, right? And then on the sort of, here's my sweet 3D cube, just like one of these guys, right? So on this glancing angle, you're getting this hue shifted version, this version of colors that has been hue shifted this way. In fact, I think it's opposite. I think it's actually this way. And saturation shifted this way, maybe a little less saturated. And I'm getting those colors along these glancing angles. And then that finally is fed into the diffuse color. But then I just adjust it one more time, take that output and put it into yet another color correct node, right here, this last one, which I shift quite a bit on hue and a fair amount on saturation. So I'm taking those colors and I'm shifting them on hue down quite a bit and on saturation quite a bit, more saturated. And I'm feeding that into the SSS channels in this constant node right here. So I'm doing a number of things, sort of similar to the smiley face, but I'm doing this instead of in the shader tree, I'm doing it in a schematic where I'm changing colors using just hue shifting, basically from my initial size gradient along the length of these guys and along the glancing angles, and sending that to diffuse color, and then just adjusting the hue and saturation even a little bit more and sending that to the subsurface channels. That's how that works. And it's my only feeling is it's a little bit easier, I think, to do this in a schematic like this. It's easier to follow how you get the inputs and outputs and the masks and everything. It's a little bit easier to follow than in the shader tree. If you look at the smiley face one, in the shader tree, it's probably a little bit harder to sort of understand how that works. My only reservation is I think in the schematic, these color correct nodes, I think even some of the other nodes, just evaluate a little more slowly than they do in the shader tree. And that may be limitations or maybe bugs. I think that's the type of thing that'll get figured out later on. But that's the node-based shading for this particular scene here, and that's how you get these subtle variations. You can kind of see it. This is a little bit hue shifted more towards the yellow on the glancing angle here, and along the length, you can see the darker on the bottom getting lighter to the top. So kind of cool. That's that. Next is Volcano. If you're still interested, I'll just go ahead and describe this one real quick as well. So there's a little more going on in the Volcano image here. The most obvious is I'm using a sphere to put in the lava, and then, or to replicate the lava, and then a cube, of course, for the mountain itself. And then I also have a volume item replicated around for the volumetrics there. This is a little bit of a close-up. It's just this little section right here. And you can see the vast scale differences, how small these guys are right down by the lava, how tiny these little replicas are compared to these guys. This is more, I think this is more similar to the differential in scale in the Lee Griggs images. And that lava looks pretty cool, I gotta say. I like the spheres down there. So it's pretty straightforward what I'm doing here. It's basically I'm starting with a particle generator, and I think the final one had 2048 by 2048 replicas, so I knocked that down to 128 just to speed up the viewport of this presentation. And then I did some things along the chain here. At the very end, we have them split up via sieve nodes going to two different replicators, right? One for lava. You can actually change the replicator. The way I got that to be read is in the replicator you can change the display to put the wireframe to user and pick a color, and you can change the color of the replicator in the viewport. And there's a sphere going there, and then there's a cube, of course, going to the replicator mountains. And so let's just kind of walk through this really quickly. So no surface particle generators here like with the Amazon. This is just a straight up grid with a particle generator right here. And the first thing I do with the particle generator is I just blow it up. I just have a basic pMod in there. And all it's doing is scaling everything up by 1,000. Just scaling everything up. But of course I'm modulating that with this fall off right there. So it's not just scaling up everything, every cube to 1,000 times bigger. It's modulating it with a textured fall off. So actually I'm going to, I'm going to turn off my lava, and let me just bypass everything and go straight to the replicator here. So this is what it looks like with all this stuff in the middle bypassed, right? So just kind of move this up, my replicator up here so you can see what's going on. So everything's scaled up 1,000 and it's going to the replicator, but we are modulating that scale up with this Volcano linear fall-off node. And that, of course, has an item mask on it. And in the shader tree over here, there it is. There's the item mask on this fall-off item. And it's got this Volcano black and white image on there. So that's mapped, planar mapped down there, fitting the terrain. And what's happening is, since it's modulating this basic size blow up, only the white parts, the lightest parts, are getting the 1,000-time increase in that this basic pMod is defining. So that 1,000 increase is only happening in the whitest areas. And in the darker areas, it's happening, as in a black area, it wouldn't be happening at all. So it's happening much lower. The scale up is much lower in the darker areas. You can kind of see, a crater here. Maybe if I zoom out a little bit, you can kind of see this part of the image right in here. And this Volcano image is further modified by a gradient. So the Volcano is set to the effect as fall-off value, right? Because that's what we're defining here. If you drop a gradient on top of it, similar to what we did in the Amazon forest, and set the input parameter to fall-off value, so it's getting this value that's existing. Remember, the shader tree is bottom up, so this is being evaluated first. The gradient is reading the fall-off value as the input parameter. So on the gradient, the fall-off values at the Volcano image values are down here. And then I'm just taking those and remapping them, right? So if this curve were linear from 0 to 100, that would just be just a regular old Volcano image. So I'm just mapping everything 1 to 1. But I've remapped it into this sort of squiggly curve here. So nothing's at 0. The smallest ones are at 5%. So I'm making sure that there's no black in the image, essentially, that's being turned to replicas to 0%. And then I'm just sort of defining the altitudes I want there. If I want these guys, for instance, to get more of the scale parameter, I'm going to bring their value up. And you'll see this affecting the viewport here. So all of these guys in the Volcano image, these darker colors, probably, they were around 15% or so. So some of these darker colors in here, if I bring this keyframe up, I'm just remapping those to brighter colors and I'm making them bigger. So don't want that, but that's how that works. So now those are back down. So let me continue on. I'll just keep doing it this way. So after we do this basic size blow up, let me pull this out of the replicator and put it back into my stream here. Oops, down to this guy, particle source. So I'll just keep on doing what I'm doing here. So the next thing I do on this random scale is I blew them all up in the first guy, and the second one I'm just giving them a random scale of 33% bigger or 33% smaller, because my range is -100 to 100, right? So any of those replicas can get the lowest value of -33% bigger or smaller up to the highest value, 33% bigger. And so that's just changing that up a little bit. So if I pump this into my replicator, you probably won't be able to tell the difference as much on this. Well, you probably can actually. So if I actually have, let me do this. So it's hard to tell the difference. But anyway, there's some random scaling going on here. Let me switch that. Do you see the movement there? Let me just push in some more. So here, this is where we were before. Okay, before random scaling, just blowing it up with the fall-off value. And here we are with random scaling. So there's a little bit of a shift there, right? Some got bigger, some got smaller. And again, this is also being modulated by this fall-off. So the biggest differences in the random scale are going to be, the brighter parts of the image, the taller mountains are going to experience the biggest randomization. After that, we can go back down here to the particle source. We have a node that says rand skinny big ones. And so rand skinny big ones is just, if you look over here at the scaling, the maximum is 15% and the minimum is -100. So I crunched it in the negative direction. And I put the scale at just 250, 0, 250. So I'm scaling X and Z uniformly. I have Y at 0. And so it's not getting any taller, but it's actually getting up to 250% skinnier, and some of them are going to get up to 15% of this number larger. So that is what I'm doing with this one. I think if I shove this in, you might be able to see the difference. So do you see some of these guys get really skinny there? So again, that's being modulated by a different fall-off. This says linear fall-off large ISO. So I have a different fall-off going in there. It's the same sort of linear fall-off like that, but it's mapped a little bit differently. So the reason it says large ISO is I've got the same volcano image here, right? But what I'm doing with my remapping is that I'm essentially selecting the greatest range for this node. So right now, this randomization is only going to be happening to the guys on the far end of the scale. Everything on this side of the scale is basically getting the fall off as 0, so it's not getting the effect of this node. Only in the very large end of the scale, the white end of that image, are we getting some skinniness going on. So when you look at this image here, what I'm really doing is I'm making these sort of bigger guys. I'm getting some really skinny bigger guys in here. Okay, moving along, you'll see sort of a trend here. What I'm doing, instead of using sieve nodes, is I'm just remapping fall-offs to select which replicas, which particles I really want to modify. So in this case, it says linear fall-off small tilt. This is this guy right here. Again, we got just the black and white volcano image, but I'm remapping those values to make all the dark parts really white and everything else black. So when this node right here, this random scale small ones node, is it's only applying its effect to the particles that fall within the maximum fall off, which is just at the very far end of this scale here. So only the very darkest parts of that volcano image are going to be made get this sort of 10% uniform scaling, negative 100, negative 10% to 10% additional scaling. And that's just the lava field, really. Those are the smallest guys here. So I'm just sort of putting a little bit of variation in the lava field here. And then using the same fall off, which is again just affecting the little guys on the outside, I'm moving them down a little bit with this basic node. So this basic node just accepts a particle source in the fall off and lets you do some transforms on them. Let me make sure I'm plugged into the replicator correctly. So let me put this basic node up here to the replicator. So again, everything is just being, all the replicas you see up here are just from up to this point in the graph, right? So that's feeding the replicator. None of these guys are in effect yet up here. But if you look at this guy, I just have it going down a little bit on Y. So I'm just moving the lava field down a little bit. In fact, if I go to a side view, you can probably, you can see some of these guys below 0. If I put this down -10 or -1 meter, you can see that they're moving down low like that, right? So there's all the lava down at the bottom. And again, they don't all move down uniformly 1 meter because there is this, fall off here that's, based on the volcano image. And the values have been remapped to the left-hand side, so just the dark parts of this, but there's still some variation in there. So, some particles are moving, down farther than others. But it's isolating the lava, essentially, moving it down. And that's important because if you look at the next node, let me just, instead of a meter, move that back up to -10 millimeters. So it's just down a little bit, right? So they're just down below, those particles, lava particles, are just down below 0. But that's important because I'm using some sieves now. So I feed this out to 2 different sieve nodes. One, sieve lava, is, as you may have guessed, it's looking at, it's an if saying it's if the position Y is less than 0. It keeps them. So this is keeping all particles whose position Y is less than 0. And that's all the guys I moved down with this little basic transform node and had isolated with my fall off here, right? So I moved those down and I sieved them out. And I streamed them off to a different replicator here. And then I've got a little random node here that all it does is it gives a little random random scaling again. I think I must have wanted a little more variation in the particles. And of course I give it a random particle ID as well, just to make sure the particle ID is randomized in case I want to use that for shading. feed that into a replicator, and and then give it a sphere prototype. So let me pull this guy out. Let's just take a look at the come up here. Let's just take a look at the lava replicator here. And so those are all those guys that have been pulled out, right? Those are all separated out, basically with this linear fall off right here, right? Where I had the gradient that went to the far left end, and I scaled them a little bit, and I moved them down, and I sieved them out, and I randomized the particle ID and a little bit of the scale, and I shoved them over to this replicator. But then I also sieved out everything above 0. So if y is greater than or equals 0, then this node keeps those particles, which is everything but the lava, sends it over to a random particle ID combiner, which is basically just this random node here, which I renamed to something that would remind me what it is, and gave those a little bit of scaling, and even moved them up in y a little bit just to separate them from the lava a little more. And of course, randomized the particle ID. And then these were, oh wait, before I sent them to the replicator, it looks like I had a remove particles. Basically, this is a sieve, which I renamed remove particles. And what it does is it looks at the particle ID that I just randomized, and then it basically takes out 15% of them. So I just sort of thinned out the mountains by 15%. And I modulated that with a fall off again. This fall off is the Volcano linear fall off, which is our first one here, which just sort of modulates by height. So basically I thinned out mostly some of the taller peaks and thinned out some of these taller ones here and kept the density down at the smaller ones, right? You know, that's because of the fall off, right? So the fall off is feeding into this sieve node, and this fall off has our volcano, right? That's been volcano image that has been remapped. And the white parts get the most value, and so this get affected by this node the most. And so most of the sieving was being done up top, the big tall ones. And then fed this into this other replicator here to create the mountains. So that's it. It's pretty straightforward. That's just how the volcano mountains were created. The volumetric item here is really easy. It's just a little particle generator, right? pMod generator. I think I've got 256 by 256, covering the 10 by 10, right? Which is the length of this, the area of this square up here. And I did a little bit of random positioning, right? I moved them quite a bit in X and Z and just a little bit up and down. Let me turn on the the volume item here so you can see it in the viewport. This might slow things down. Is it visible in the viewport? GL display, turn on. Turn on and slow me down. Slow down my node. Okay. Can I do a... Man, this really needs a percentage slider for how much of this GL I should be viewing. But let me do it this way. I'm gonna take my generator. This is what's nice about procedural workflows, right? I can go back to this guy. I can say 256. That's way too much. My display is super slow. Let's just do 64. And over here on Z, 64. Okay, so thin that out a little bit. So let's take a look at these black guys in here. And let me turn off these other ones so you can kind of see what's going on. This is the volumetrics, right? And so it goes into this randomization node. It randomizes the scale by 50% in all directions, right? Either 50% bigger or 50% smaller because there's our range. But it also, really shoves the position over quite a bit, 0.6 meters in X and Z, or up to negative 0.6 as well, and just a little bit in Y though. And it's modulated by this volume linear fall off. Okay, so I've got yet another linear fall off, and you can bet that it's item masked, and inside that item mask is a noise texture. And you can just see where the noise is white and where the noise is black, right? That's what's going on there. Then I have a basic scale Y where I squished them down in Y, so if you look at them from the side, they're not spheres anymore, they're sort of flattened discs. And that's kind of it. I guess I have a sieve in there to remove particles when the fall off is less than 0.5. So that's where you get these gaps, right? So if I were to say remove particles if fall off is less than 0, I'm not going to remove anything, or I'm going to remove everything. That shouldn't be anything. Let's see here. Maybe it doesn't understand 0. So, oh, I'm sorry, not remove, keep. So if the fall off is less than 1, which it is everywhere because it only goes up to 1, then I'm going to keep the particle, so I'm keeping everything. If the fall off is less than 0.5, then that's what I'm going to keep. So I'm just keeping this sort of darker areas of the fractal noise cloud actually texture. It's not the lighter areas. If I said greater than 0.5, I'd be keeping the lighter areas, but I'm actually taking less than 0.5. So, and that's how I sort of thinned these out there to get that look. And then, you know, they just render out. They just go right into the particle, the volume item as a particle source. And then I wound up with something that looked like this, actually. So that's what came out of Modo. And I just created I think I did a render pass where I made, you know, the prototype essentially a completely black, no alpha channel, no shading, just 100% luminous black with no alpha. And it, you know, it rendered the fog on top of that, so you can see these peaks poking through. And then in After Effects, I just used this as a mask, a Luma mask. So it's really sort of thinning it out, right? So this guy here is, let me just turn up the opacity, whoops, is using this image as a Luma mask. So it's sort of faded out a little bit, and, you know, obviously it's a Luma mask, so it's not in the black parts. It's completely alpha'd out now. It's transparent, so you see the Volcano underneath it, and I think I adjusted the opacity a little bit. There's probably I didn't even put any color effects on it. That's it. So I should probably, you know, do something where I can do a little bit of curve adjustment or something like that on these on the fog there. You can kind of see, make it a little redder, you know, do whatever. Maybe a little less opaque, but, you know, there's the fog. Looks kind of cool. That's all I did with that. The nodal shading, this all looks kind of complicated in here, but it's essentially very similar to what I did with the Amazon one. The one thing I did do is I put in some luminous colors for the lava. So I've got some constant luminous color here and luminous amount. You know, and you can see that there's a noise texture, essentially a remapped noise texture on the lava to give this sort of variation in there. It's just a noise texture remapped in a color correction node. In fact, let me take a look at the pre-comp here. I'll just isolate that. And, you know, the color correct node lets you sort of remap the noise colors and make it more contrasty. It's much better. The color correct node is much better than using the gain and bias controls on the texture. And I use some, again, for luminous amount and luminous color. And then they're just, you know, they're just on just a little bit of a glow on here. Boom. And yeah, it looks pretty cool. That's, let me turn on this guy. In fact, because it's luminous, it's also providing some light, you know, with the global illumination on, you can see that some of that's the glow, but you can see that, you know, there's some orangey-ness going on here. That's just the you know, global illumination from the luminous colors here on those rectangular replicas. So that's it. Pretty cool. I kind of like this part in here. Looks kind of neat. I don't know. I mean, whoops, there we go. There's the close-up. And I honestly feel like I never did get the quality of images that were on the Arnold plus XREF's images that Lee Griggs did. I just think his look better. Maybe that's just me. I think Modo does an admirable job of... pMods are actually very powerful, being able to go in there and take a particle source and just sort of split it up and randomize it and do some cool stuff with it and feed it into multiple replicators and, you know, use these textured fall-offs. It's actually very powerful. And the nodal shading is quite powerful as well. Some of the things that made his images so cool, though, was the extreme depth of field and some of the really hot sort of glancing angle reflections. And I never got that look in Modo. I just wasn't able to do it. In fact, I did the depth of field here in After Effects. It's just I rendered out this depth map here and just use a filter on it. I like that better than Modo's depth of field. But overall, I was quite happy with how Modo handled everything. Turn the glow back on there. And you know, the Amazon one's pretty cool too. I you know, if I had time, I would render this out as an animation. You can see the you'd be able to see the water rippling and flowing there, and I think that'd be kind of a cool, you could fly all the way in and see these guys up close moving and jumbling in there. I thought that would be kind of cool, but I don't have a lifetime to render, and even on a 16 core machine, this took quite a while to render, and it's just got millions. I think what 3 million replicas. It's quite a bit. So I think Modo was really memory intensive handling the replicas. It was taking like 30 or 40 gigs of RAM. There's got to be a better way. I would guess that Maya and Arnold handled that a little better than Modo. I'm not sure it was Modo's renderer so much as Modo itself holding that many particles in memory. So I think there's some compression techniques to lower the memory requirement there, but maybe I'll file some bugs on that. Anyway, that's it. I think I'm done with these forever. I've got really into it, and then I just kind of too much, man. Maybe I'll revisit these silly things. All right, bye.